Hey everyone, welcome back to the Krusty Krab. This is part 2 of our table video. If you missed part 1 and you don't know how the table works in MUI v5, make sure you go check it out. But in part 2, I will specifically be covering how to do these checkbox thingies, how to do the filtering, how to do the actual sorting on tables, and what pagination is and how to use it in MUI's table component. And if you find value, make sure you leave a comment. It helps so much with the YouTube algorithm. And if you like videos about React and MUI, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can learn every single day as I upload. So let's go ahead and open up this big example and let's split it up into 3 different parts. First, we're going to talk about the actual checkbox components. Then we're going to talk about the sorting that you see over here. And then finally, we're going to talk about how to use pagination in your tables. And note, each individual one of these can be added to a basic table without the other one. So if you only wanted sorting or you only wanted pagination, you could completely do that by itself, or maybe pick 2 out of the 3. Or if you have a really complex table and you need all 3, you can go ahead and pretty much just copy this exact example. But let's go through the code. And first of all, let's talk about the actual selectiveness here, where you can actually select items. So let's dive deep into this code. You can see in the header, they actually have a checkbox before they have the regular header cells. And another difference between this and the basic table is they actually have the header cells in a array this time, and all they're doing here is they are pretty much just going ahead and they are mapping through every single header cell and just creating a table cell and passing that in. So let's talk about the checkbox part of it. You can see here that if you are unfamiliar with our checkboxes or how checkboxes work, I have a whole nother video on that as well. But essentially what you need to know from that is that they are using this as a controlled input, which means they are keeping track of the actual state through this actual checked and intermediate prop. And then they also have an on-change handler to handle checking everything. So the first thing we're going to look at is the checked. If all the rows, pretty much all this logic equates to is if all the row counts, if the number of rows selected here is equal to the actual amount of rows you have, we're going to make this selected. And the reason I do that is because for this header one, this should only be selected if every single one of these rows is selected, obviously. And you can see here, if I only select 1 or 2, instead of a check, we actually have this sort of line, and that is known as the intermediate state. So you can see here, if we have selected, more than 0, but it's less than all the rows, then we are actually going to show this intermediate. And that's all the logic that they have there for that. And they can actually simplify this checked one to just making sure if number selected is equal to row count, because row count is hard coded, so you don't really need to make sure if the row count is greater than 0, because if the number of selected is equal to the total amount of rows, it's always going to be fully checked. But we don't have to worry about that. That's just a small little improvement that they could do for the next iteration of this component. But anyways, let's go ahead and look at what they're actually doing. And to get a clearer example of the actual code itself, we can maybe look at the gist that they have on GitHub, just to see the code a bit more easier and search through it a bit more easier. So back to this checkbox, let's go ahead and see what this on select all click actually does. So so that gets passed in through their enhanced table head. Note that their enhanced table header, they're just passing in a bit of styles, and that's what makes it look a bit more different. So it's just a wrapper around the actual thing that they have. And the actual handler that they have for the checkbox is over here. So if it is selected, if when they click it, we are changing the state to selected, then all they are going to do is they are going to go ahead and go through all the IDs, map all the IDs to the actual name of the row itself or the column itself, and set it equal to true, essentially. So this selected, you can see here where you have set selected. This is just a state variable that keeps track of all the actual row names or column names that are selected. So all they're doing is they're going through every single selected, every single row that you would find, and they're adding everything to be selected and just setting it to it. And then if it is unchecked, that means we are not selecting everything, or rather unselecting everything. They're just setting this selected array to just an empty array. And that is what that is pretty much the logic they have for this top button over here. Pretty much, if we are clicking it to selected, select every single row. If we're unselecting it, unselect every single row. And that is pretty much all there is to this top button. And of course, that intermediate logic where if only some of the rows are selected, then just show it as intermediate. And that's pretty much all there is to the actual logic for that top button, which is obviously going to work different than the actual regular buttons that get selected over here. So now let's go and see what happens if you select the checkbox on a regular row. So let's come back over here, scroll a bit up, and let's go to this. So this is their enhanced table, which I showed you before, and all they have here is just the regular table header, and just a bit of, they pass the props through sort of a filtered component, which in my opinion, I don't really think that you actually need to do. But anyways, let's look for our other checkbox component. And it looks like, oh, we have it over here. Okay. So this is the rest of the table body. So you can see here in the rest of the table, after we have our header, we have our table body, and we have some sorting logic, which we will go over a bit later. And then we have the actual row itself. And all we are going to do in this row is we have some logic to check whether or not it is actually checked. So you can see over here, if it's checked, if the item, item is selected, is going to be a Boolean, and all they have is they have another function where they actually check whether or not the row name is inside of that state variable that we talked about before. And they pass it through a custom function they call is selected. But if we look at the definition of is selected, that's essentially what they do. They just check to see if the index of the name of that row is selected or not, and if it isn't, or is in that selected array or not. And if it is, you're going to show it as selected, and if not, you're going to show it as not selected. So that's all this logic is really doing. And for the checkbox, they're just passing in whether it's checked or not. The actual on-click handler, they're passing it into the table row. And the reason they do this is because they want to make it so that wherever you click on the row, it actually checks it or unchecks it, instead of just if you were to click on the actual component itself. And that's the other cool thing about MUI components and just React in general. You can pass in on-click handlers to almost anything. So just note that you can, for this checkbox, for each one of these rows, you can pass the on-click handler onto the actual row itself, so that when you click anywhere on the row, it clicks, and not just on the actual checkbox itself. So that is what they're doing here. So all they're doing here is on the on-click handler, they're passing it into a handle click function. And if we look at that handle click function, there is just a bit of logic on how to do it. So first thing they're going to do is they're going to get the actual selected index of it, so the index of the actual array, and then they're going to get the new selected array, and they're going to pretty much determine what they want to do. So for example, if it doesn't already exist in the actual array, so if this row is unselected, we're essentially just going to make our selected ID, the selected array, equal to the original one, but we're also gonna concatenate, the actual row that we just selected to it. So pretty much it's just sort of complex logic to add the row that we just selected to the list of already selected rows. That is pretty much like all there is to it. If we want to make it, if it's already selected, and it's at the beginning, all we're going to do is slice it, and all that is really going to do is it's going to just make it so that we unselect it. And the reason they have these different ifs is because depending on where the actual checked row is in that checked row array list, you have to do a different array operation to it. So in this one, if it's the first element, that means it's already in the selected list, which means we are unselecting it. So we are going to make the new state variable of selected rows equal to the old one, but we are going to start from the element after the 0th element, which is our element. So pretty much we're just chopping off that part of the array. So we're unselecting it by chopping off that part of the array. The same thing's going to happen if it's at the end of the array, and if it's somewhere in the middle, they pretty much just have some logic to take every single element around that element and concatenate it together. So all these three else if statements are just pretty much to remove that element from the actual array. depending on where it is in the array. And all of this one is, just to add it to the array if it's not already there. This is pretty convoluted logic in my opinion. I'm sure there is a far simpler way to do this, especially if you know JavaScript a bit more. And I don't think they really needed to overcomplicate the logic like this, but it is what it is essentially. And the last part we have to the actual checkbox component is sort of at the top here where they show how many are selected. So to find where that code lives, we're just going to Control F selected, and it looks like we're not going to have an easy time doing it. But you can see in the enhanced table header, we are passing in the number of selected into it. So if we just go back up to that enhanced table header, which lives up here, we can go ahead and just check and see where they're actually passing that in over here. So we can see we have that checkbox. Which comes in over there, but it looks like it's actually getting passed in somewhere else. So maybe if I pass in selected, or maybe like quotes at the end of it to try and find it, to try and see where that code is actually being passed in. Or maybe let's search for the actual icon button over here. So this delete icon button. So delete icon. So you can see here that they are specifically using that delete icon here. And okay, so it looks like they hid it in something called the table toolbar, which is another component. And I'm not too big of a fan of how they structure this really complex table example. They're splitting everything up into like pretty much different components and having it all sort of like in one file to make it easier for people to read. But in reality, it gets like really complex, especially when they're also imbuing a bunch of stuff like this where they're trying to show off their stylings and stuff like that. It sort of just makes the example really complex and sort of unnecessarily difficult to read the code of. But essentially you can see here, all they have is if the number of selected items is greater than 0, they're going to show, the number of selected items and then selected after that. So, 13 selected. If there is nothing selected, it's just going to show the title of the table, which is just nutrition. And that is pretty much it for the entire checkbox part of the table itself. Now let's move on to the actual sorting of these columns. The sorting of these columns. So if we go back to the enhanced table header, table head, you can see here that all of these actual cells for the table header, you can see here that they all have a sort direction. So this sort direction is sort of gonna show you based on show this icon based on whether or not the sort is up or down. And if we go to the table header, the table cell component, which you can see over here, you can see that this sort direction prop is what they are passing in, depending on whether or not we are actually sorting on that component. So first of all, we're going to see if whether or not the order by cell header ID is equal to this one. So pretty much we're saying because only one header can be sorted at a time. So let me go back over here. Only one header can be sorted at a time. Where is that example? Let's go all the way back up here. So we can only sort by calories, or we can sort by fat or carbs or protein. You can see that we can't sort by every single thing at the exact same time. So because of that, what they're doing here is they are checking if the actual order by ID is equal to the header cell ID. And if it is, we are passing in the order that we are keeping track of. Now, these are two different state variables that they have. One is called order by, which stores the actual ID of the cell we are sorting by. And one is the actual order, which stores the actual order, whether it's ascending or descending, that we are sorting by. So that is what they are passing in here. And then on the actual sort label itself, which is another component that they are passing in, and this sort direction only, as you can see here, controls it for the area sort direction, which is for like, accessibility reasons. But over here on this table sort label is where you're actually going to get this like little component here, this little icon here. So they are using that to pass in, and the active is just going to be whether or not this is the thing we're sorting by. The direction, obviously, we talked about, and then the on-click handler. So this on-click leads to another custom function that they've made called create sort handler. Sort handler. So let's go ahead and look at that. And all they're doing is they're pretty much passing it into another function called on request sort. And just for a bit of context, I looked at this code briefly before making this video, but a lot of this is me going through it for the first time, other than the last time I made a video on a lot of this stuff. So I'm sort of looking at this, and I'm going through it the same way you would probably be going through it if you were looking at this the first time. But I hope by me going through it with you, it adds a bit of a bit more ease, and I'm doing sort of all the hard work, I guess, of like actually digging deep into this code and understanding how it works. But essentially, after three different different functions we've been sort of passed on to, we finally find the actual component or function that's handling the setter of this state variable. And essentially all they are doing is looking at the property, and they're pretty much just setting the order equal to whatever the order has already been, or if it's new, the default order. And then they're just setting the property equal to the ID, the order by equal to the property, which is just the header cell ID. So as you can see, the actual underlying logic is pretty simple. You're just keeping track of two state variables, which column is being sorted, and whether it's sorting by ascending or descending. However, this example, and this is probably one of MUI's maybe least well-built components, especially for the example, is extremely convoluted and unnecessarily complex. But that is essentially how this part of it works. Whoops. That is essentially how this part of, being able to sort over here and click what you want to sort by and display what is being sorted by works. Now let's go into the actual sorting part itself. So for that, we're going to have to look at the actual table body because that is where everything is being sorted. So we can see here in the table body, and all they are doing is normally in a table, you will be just having a map of all the different row items. What they're doing here is before they map through all the row items, they are essentially just pre-sorting it. There is no way to pass in a sorting function to MUI's actual components itself. You are going to have to do the actual sorting through like comparator functions on your own. So you can see here they have a get comparator function, which you pass in the order and the order by. So depending on whether or not you are sorting by ascending or descending, you are going to be using a different comparator. And you can see here they are passing it into another custom function, which is called stable sort. And in this, they are just passing in the actual rows and the sorting function itself. So that is pretty simple in its own. Let's talk about how they do the comparators. So get comparator. You can see here, if it's a descending, this is your comparator function. You're going to do a descending comparator. You're going to pass in each row. And if you're not familiar with this is like really heavy JavaScript related sorting code. You can find like explanations to this on like W3 schools or, Stack Overflow. But essentially, this is what, if you ever wanted to sort it by any conditions, even outside of MUI in this whole table situation, you probably need to make your own sorting function. And pretty much it all just looks like this, where you pass in the logic depending on what it is you're trying to sort by. So I'm not going to go over this in depth, but just know that this is like pretty much their way of doing it based on sort by. Like a lot of the times, if you're just sorting by maybe like, which number is bigger and stuff like that, you just do, if A is bigger than B, return 1, else return -1, or something like that. Or if the same, return 0. But essentially, if we go back to the get comparator, which is right over here, all they're doing is if the order by is descending, they do descending. If not, they take the reverse of the descending array. And pretty much that is all there really is to sorting. After that, they just, sort it by the actual, they actually just sort it using that comparator function that they have written, and they compare it against the actual rows. So by this point in time, you have the sorted table based on all of these, different comparators, depending on whether it's ascending or descending, and also compared on the actual thing you are sorting by. This part has to do with pagination and pagination only. So let's move into part 3, which is going to be the actual pagination of this component. So pagination is a lot simpler than what we just talked about. Essentially, you just have this little pagination thing at the bottom, which displays, you know, how many rows per page you want. And over here in the actual table itself, we are mapping and slicing our data, our sorted data, depending on how many, you know, what page we're on and how many rows per page we are on. So you can see here, the logic they have here for the slice is they're going to start at the page times rows per page. So, you know, if page is page 0, it's going to start at item 0, and then it's going to go until we get to the actual row that is the end of this page. So pretty much this page times page per row will equal to 0 times 5, which is 0, and then they're going to plus 5 because that's how many rows per page you have. Essentially, if you're on the first page, this slice is going to only show you elements 0 to 5, which is inclusive of 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is 5 items. And then when you go on page 2, you'll start at page item 5 and end at item 10, which is going to be items 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And that's pretty much the math of how your pagination works. And if we go to the actual bottom, we can see here we are just passing in, and this is probably the easiest part of everything we've talked about so far, the table pagination component, which renders all this stuff at the bottom of your table. Make sure you leave it outside the table and table container, and you just put it inside of the paper if you want a clean look like this. So it doesn't get bunched into things with like the actual, you know, scrolling and stuff like that of your table, depending on the responsiveness. But essentially, all you're going to pass in is the row option. So in this case, you can choose between 5, 10, and 25 row objects. Component div, you don't need to worry about that. I believe that's default. They do need, however, this prop that shows them the total count of items. That's how they're able to see, like, you know, 1 to 5 of 13. You're also going to need to keep track of the rows per page that you're currently on through a state variable, which you then pass, you know, on rows per page change. So in that state variable, you can just have a state variable where you pass in the actual thing and then the handler to change that, as well as the page you are on, which is a state variable, and the on change handler to pass in the page you are on. And for both of these, if we go to like handle on page change, you can see here all they're doing is taking in parameters from the MUI pagination component, and of that, the second parameter, which they have named here new page, is just going to be equal to the page value. So you would just set that in your React state variable. And that is pretty much it. Pagination, like I said, is the simplest of all of the things we have talked about so far, but that is pretty much how you do a completely custom big boy table like you see on this. And like I said, the code is very, very, very messy and very unoptimized in my opinion for this example. There's a lot simpler ways to actually do this, but it would take a lot of refactoring and you know, maybe an hour to rewrite all of this in a custom way that is a lot easier to read and a lot more custom. I don't think they had to make it this complex, but nonetheless, that is an explanation of this entire table pagination component, this 400 line component. So if you found value in this and if you learned anything, leave a comment. It helps a lot with the YouTube algorithm, and make sure you subscribe and hit that notifications bell if you want to learn more about MUI and React, and I'll see you guys in the next video.